Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
In this edition of Global Print, I will talk to you about the pro-farmer tweets by international celebrities like Rihanna, by the climate change activist Greta Thunberg, as well as by Meena Harris, who is the niece of the US Vice President Kamala Harris. Why the government is so upset about it and what it is doing to counter this. But before that, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you. Please do subscribe and pay just a little bit for the Print's journalism. You know that we have been bringing to you across the pandemic these last several months the best news stories, the best videos. And with your encouragement and your support, I'd like to request you to pay just a little bit for our work. There is a link in the description of this video, both for an international audience as well as a domestic one. So please continue to support us. Now back to my column, Global Print, in which I talk about the impact of the tweets by international celebrities like Rihanna, Greta Thunberg, as well as by Meena Harris. And you know that the Indian government, the Ministry of External Affairs actually, some days ago came out very strongly against it. It was tweeted, the statement was tweeted and retweeted by several ministers in the Modi government, not just by External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, but also by the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman and many others. The hashtag was India Against Propaganda. The statement didn't name anybody, but subsequently, intelligence sources have told The Print, my colleague Ananya Bharadwaj, that Rihanna, the big international pop icon with 100 billion followers on Twitter, that she was paid or allegedly paid $2.5 million to post that tweet. And Greta Thunberg, who tweeted a toolkit, which is basically a document on how to support these farmer protests that are taking place around Delhi for over 75 days now, what the protests are about, then the world should support them. Again, intelligence sources have said that this toolkit that was tweeted by Greta Thunberg is actually been masterminded by Khalistani activists in Canada. And the allegation, not so overtly stated, is that there is some sort of a connection between the Pakistan ISI and the Canadian Khalistani activists. Basically, there being this foreign hand behind the protests that have been taking place in Delhi, the farmer protests, and the political outcry and the political issues that have taken place as a result of these protests. What the Indian government is saying is that these protests are not as simple and straightforward, that there is a foreign hand behind it. And this phrase, foreign hand, some of us who are old enough know that this was very closely associated with Mrs. Indira Gandhi, former Prime Minister. In fact, it was Indira Gandhi who first brought this phrase into the Indian political lexicon, the foreign hand. And sometimes you wonder what she was afraid of. She was perhaps young enough to remember the PL 480, India's dependence on PL 480 grain that it imported from the US. Certainly, she was the Prime Minister when the war with Pakistan takes place in 1971, and she's hailed as the Durga because in that war, Pakistan is split into two and the new country called Bangladesh comes into being. But it was during that war that the US supported Pakistan. So perhaps Indira Gandhi hid behind that phrase to hide her own political insecurities at home, using the lever of an alleged foreign hand to blame what was happening inside the country of her own travails, whether it was the emergency or other issues that the opposition brought up, and that's how she used this phrase. If we cut to the president, and I will talk to you about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's speech in Parliament on Monday in the Rajya Sabha when he was responding to the president's motion, in which he uses a very interesting phrase. He says, "हम सब जानते हैं कि FDI क्या होता है, foreign direct investment, और हम सबको चाहिए कि इंडिया के अंदर foreign direct investment आए." I'm just paraphrasing him. And then he goes on to say, लेकिन अब मैंने देखा है कि आजकल एक FDI जो है सब जगह छाया हुआ है, मैदान में आ गया है, और ये FDI है Foreign Destructive Ideology. So the Prime Minister punning on the abbreviation of that, FDI, Foreign Direct Investment, and Foreign Destructive Ideology. So I argue that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's foreign hand moment took a long while coming, but it's finally here. And why do I say that? So you might ask that Indira Gandhi was using the foreign hand to hide her political deficiencies at home, but why would Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who has been traveling across the globe, especially in his first term as Prime Minister, meeting kings, queens, monarchs, elected prime ministers and presidents, sheikhs, leaders of the Communist Party, for example, in China, and he has wowed his audiences across the globe. He has been cheered, he has been applauded. Why is somebody like him using the foreign hand as a pejorative? What is he nervous about? If you look at the BJP's right-wing politics, you will know that there is a very clear distinction that BJP leaders make. The first is that they do not like any criticism from abroad. We saw this even in 2002 when Atal Bihari Vajpayee was Prime Minister and the Gujarat riots had just taken place. Prime Minister Modi was at the time Chief Minister of Gujarat, of course. And in these riots, about 1,000 people were killed. And I remember that the European Union ambassadors had come visiting to the Ministry of External Affairs and they had brought a delegation and they wanted to present a démarche to the Foreign Office, which was critical of the lives lost in the 2002 riots. Now, the Foreign Secretary at the time refused to accept the delegation and the Europeans were sent back packing. So this refusal to accept any criticism, even when something as major as the riots took place. To cut to the present, when Modi is Prime Minister in his first term, if you remember that several foreign NGOs, big ones at that, the Ford Foundation, Greenpeace, were told to shut shop and get out of India if all they wanted to do was to tweet the bad news story. In his second term, as he comes back with a bigger majority, with a bigger mandate, Prime Minister Modi has become even more confident. And his External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, you've seen that confidence where he, during a visit to the US, for example, he would much rather call off a meeting of the Foreign Affairs Committee in which the Democrat leader, Pramila Jayapal, was president. And Pramila Jayapal, if you remember, had been very critical of India's revocation of Article 317 in 2019. So Mr. Jaishankar would rather call off a meeting in the US Congress, which is their Houses of Parliament, but refused to meet Pramila Jayapal. There was a denunciation, of course, of foreigners who criticized India on the Citizenship Amendment Act. And again, the Foreign Office rejected that criticism as unwarranted. Clearly, though, in this particular case with Rihanna, Greta Thunberg, and Meena Harris tweeting, something has shifted in the government. Now, Rihanna is a big icon. She has 100 million followers on Twitter. So whether or not she was allegedly paid $2.5 million, as we reported in the print, although Indian intelligence agencies who gave this story, how they had access to that kind of information, nobody knows, because certainly they don't have access to the servers on which Twitter is based, because those servers are presumably in the US. But anyway, this is what Indian intelligence agencies said. So this attempt at discrediting Rihanna or Greta Thunberg is, whether it's foolproof or not, is not the point right now. But if you noticed, there was a stoic silence regarding Meena Harris. And why do you think that happened? Certainly because she is Vice President Kamala Harris's niece. And the two are said to be very, very close. Now, overnight, Prime Minister Modi has spoken again to Joe Biden, the US President, and both of them have agreed to take this relationship forward on shared priorities with a great deal of understanding. Clearly, what the Prime Minister is indicating, and his tweet came very late at night, is that despite all this other noise and distraction by foreign celebrities on the farmers' protest, India and the US will march hand in hand together in the coming years. He is also trying to put behind him, the Prime Minister, is that although he had a very close relationship with Donald Trump, the previous US president, and we remember that rally in Houston when Prime Minister Modi held Donald Trump's hand and said, "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar." And despite this very close relationship between India and the US, under the Donald Trump administration, India is ready to shift gear and march with the Joe Biden administration, with the Democrats, although they have a much more invasive view, especially on issues like human rights. And then there is the RSS, which is getting very involved in spreading the good message of the Modi government's foreign policy. Several of them have been talking to several retired ambassadors over the last several months on various issues of India's foreign policy. There's been, and in the last few weeks, we have seen 3 such statements that have been issued by this Indian ambassadors group. One, there was an open letter to the WTO showcasing the hypocrisy between Western nations, on the one hand at the WTO, and the other criticizing the farmer protests in India. Then there was a letter that was critical of the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on again his comments on the farmers. And the first letter was in support of the French President Emmanuel Macron on Islamic fundamentalism. So here is the RSS getting involved with spreading the message with one group of retired diplomats called the Indian Ambassadors Group. Then there is another retired bureaucrat group which calls itself the Constitutional Conduct Group. This has bureaucrats from across the services, also the Indian Foreign Service, like former foreign secretaries Shyam Saran, Shiv Shankar Menon, as well as former ambassadors like Dev Mukherjee. So interesting how 2 groups, one exclusively of former diplomats, largely seem to be supportive of the Modi government's foreign policy, and another group which is far more critical of the foreign policy. So inside and outside Parliament, I say in my column, Global Print, the Prime Minister inside Parliament, other stakeholders outside, talking about the foreign policy of the Modi government and squaring the circle. This is Jyoti Malhotra for Global Print. Please do read my column and tell me what you think.